I need a doctor. My wife. She's pregnant. She can't breathe." The billionaire's raw plea echoed through the tense airplane cabin. His wife, beautiful and pale, gasped on the narrow floor, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate terror. Flight attendants, their faces masks of professional concern, barely concealing rising panic, rushed and fumbled with an emergency kit. Then a voice, young, unexpectedly calm, yet laced with an undeniable urgency, sliced through the chaos. "It's a pulmonary embolism. The symptoms are clear. And if we don't act in the next few minutes..." Every head turned. Standing in the aisle, his gaze locked on the struggling woman, was a black teenager in a worn hoodie. The billionaire Arthur Sinclair could only stare, his mind reeling. Who was this boy, and what in God's name could he possibly mean? The answers to Arthur's desperate questions and the astonishing events that followed promise a journey that will challenge assumptions and redefine courage. Subscribe so you don't miss a single heart-stopping moment, and share with us in the comments below. What was your very first thought when that young, steady voice cut through all that panic? Two souls at opposite ends of the sprawling metropolis, one old, one young, each carried their own invisible burdens, their own quiet hopes. They moved through the rhythm of their disparate lives, wholly unaware that the vast, indifferent sky arching over the city tonight would soon bind their fates together in a way neither could ever have foreseen. In a small, meticulously kept apartment in Harlem, where the scent of medicinal herbs and old books always lingered, Marcus Johnson pored over a worn anatomy textbook. The afternoon sun slanting through the ajar blinds illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, each a tiny, fleeting star in his focused world. At 17, Marcus carried a weight of responsibility that would have buckled many grown men. His grandmother, Esther Johnson, was his universe. Her laughter, though sometimes raspy from the COPD that clung to her, was the soundtrack of his life. Her hands, gnarled by arthritis, had guided him, comforted him, and clapped with pride at his every small achievement. Esther watched him now from her armchair, a soft smile playing on her lips, though a flicker of pain danced in her eyes as she shifted. "You keep that nose buried in those books, Dr. Marcus," she said, her voice a warm, familiar caress, "and you'll forget the way back home from that fancy London place." Marcus looked up, his young face, usually so serious, softening into a grin. "Never, Grandma. Besides, who else would remember to bring you your favorite ginger snap cookies?" He'd earned the affectionate title, Dr. Marcus, in the neighborhood, half in jest, half in awe, ever since he'd correctly diagnosed Mrs. Henderson's cat, Mittens, with a common ear infection, saving her a vet bill she couldn't afford. Mittens, to everyone's relief, was still purring contentedly on Mrs. Henderson's lap. But the London program, that was no jest. The Young Medical Achievers International program, a golden ticket, a full scholarship, his only conceivable path to medical school. The acceptance had been a miracle, the partial scholarship a blessing. The remaining costs for airfare and accommodation, however, felt like a mountain. He'd scraped together every penny from part-time jobs, saved birthday money, and the small life insurance policy his mother had left. This trip wasn't just about a future career. It was about a future for Esther, a future free from the constant worry of medical bills and the unreliable heating in their fifth-floor walk-up. The broken elevator in their building was a constant, bitter reminder of their daily struggle, especially for Esther. Money's important child, no doubt Esther would say, her wisdom a comforting balm. But that mind of yours, that heart you've got, that's the real treasure. Just don't go diagnosing every pigeon you see in London, all right? She winked, and Marcus chuckled, the knot of anxiety in his stomach loosening just a little. Across town, in a penthouse apartment that seemed to float above the city's ceaseless hum, Arthur Sinclair, a titan of industry, a name synonymous with global finance, was also preparing for a trip to London. He was due to receive the prestigious Global Humanitarian of the Year award. The irony, a sharp private thing, was not lost on him. His most significant philanthropic endeavor, a state-of-the-art medical center in Rwanda, had initially been proposed by his accountants as a rather brilliant tax strategy. It was his wife, Eleanor, who had breathed genuine soul into it. Eleanor Sinclair, at 43, radiated an ethereal glow, her pregnancy at 24 weeks, softening the usually sharp, sculpted lines of her face. This child, their first after years of heartache and disappointment, was their most precious, most fragile hope. Dr. Evans had assured them that travel in the second trimester was perfectly safe, but a quiet unease had settled in Eleanor's heart, a feeling she meticulously hid from Arthur. "Darling, are you sure you wouldn't rather? I accepted the award via video link," Arthur asked, his voice a carefully modulated baritone, his eyes, however, flicking from his constantly buzzing smartphone. "Your comfort is paramount." Eleanor smiled a practiced, serene expression. "Nonsense, Arthur. I want to be there beaming with pride." Besides, she teased, gently reaching out to playfully tap his phone, "if you keep staring at that thing, it might just turn into your new wife." "Then who would applaud for you?" Arthur managed a distracted smile, his mind already pivoting to a new alert flashing on the screen. "Of course, my dear." Unthinkable. He leaned in to kiss her cheek, a perfunctory gesture, before his attention was once again consumed by the demands of his empire. Eleanor sighed softly, a familiar ache of loneliness briefly touching her. She pressed a hand to her lower abdomen, a fleeting, almost imperceptible flutter there. "Just your baby doing a little happy dance, I suppose," she murmured to herself, a brave smile for the empty room. Later, as she packed her suitcase, a sudden sharp tightness gripped her chest, stealing her breath for a terrifying second. It passed as quickly as it came, leaving her a little shaken. She dismissed it. Stress, perhaps, or just one of the many strange new sensations of pregnancy. She wouldn't worry Arthur. He had enough on his mind. Back in Harlem, Marcus, too, was packing his battered backpack. He tucked in his carefully ironed shirt, his worn but clean jeans, and his precious bundle of medical notes. As he idly flipped through them, his eyes landed on a page detailing the risks of pulmonary embolism during long-haul flights, particularly for pregnant women. A strange cold shiver ran down his spine, a premonition he couldn't name, couldn't understand. He shook his head, chiding himself for being overly imaginative. The vast, impersonal expanse of JFK International Airport later that evening was a study in contrasts. The Sinclairs whisked through a private check-in, settled into the hushed luxury of the first-class lounge. Arthur, ever the businessman, tried to be attentive, fussing slightly over Eleanor's comfort as they navigated towards the gate, perhaps a little too conscious of the eyes that followed them. But his movements had a certain rehearsed quality. Eleanor, leaning on his arm, offered graceful smiles, though a faint line of worry creased her brow. Miles away, it felt, in the bustling, echoing cavern of the main terminal, Marcus Johnson stood in the long, serpentine economy line. He clutched his boarding pass, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, a mix of exhilaration and a deep, gnawing fear of the unknown. He shifted his backpack, the weight of his grandmother's hopes, his own dreams settling heavier on his young shoulders. He glanced towards the gleaming first-class entrance, a world away from his own, unaware that the invisible threads of fate were already tightening, drawing these disparate lives, these separate worlds, towards an inevitable dramatic intersection high above the indifferent Atlantic. The journey had begun. High above the inky blackness of the Atlantic, cocooned within the monotonous drone of the jet engines, a silent, terrifying nightmare began to take shape. 4 hours into the flight, the dimmed cabin lights cast long dancing shadows, and most passengers were lost in the uneasy slumber of transatlantic travel. But for Eleanor Sinclair, sleep was an impossibility. The vague discomfort she'd felt earlier had now blossomed into a suffocating tightness in her chest, a relentless pressure that stole her breath with every shallow gasp. She shifted in her spacious first-class pod, trying to find a position that offered relief. But the ache only intensified. A cold sweat beaded on her forehead. "Arthur," she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy sound, her hand instinctively flying to her chest. Arthur Sinclair, who had finally drifted into a light, restless sleep, his mind still cataloguing stock prices and corporate strategies, was awake in an instant. Years of high-stakes business had made him a chronically light sleeper. "Eleanor, what is it? What's wrong?" His voice was sharp with sudden alarm. I can't seem to catch my breath," she managed each word an effort. Her lips, he noticed with a jolt of pure terror, were taking on an alarming bluish tint. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his customary composure. He slammed the call button, his knuckles white. Susan, the senior flight attendant, whose kind eyes had earlier crinkled with a reassuring smile, appeared moments later. Her professional poise faltered fractionally as she took in Eleanor's distress and Arthur's ashen face. "Mrs. Sinclair, are you all right? She needs a doctor." Arthur's voice was louder than he intended, cracking with a fear he hadn't felt since his first major business failure decades ago. "She can't breathe." Susan knelt beside Eleanor, her movements swift and practiced. "Mrs. Sinclair, try to take slow, deep breaths for me." "How far along are you?" "Dear 24 weeks, Arthur supplied his hand, gripping Eleanor's, which felt terrifyingly cold and limp. "Is there a doctor on this flight?" "There must be a doctor." Another first-class passenger, a portly man in an expensive suit, peered over his seat, not with concern, but with distinct irritation. "I certainly hope this episode isn't going to delay our arrival in London. I have a critical board meeting at 9. Arthur shot him a venomous glare, but his focus snapped back to Eleanor as she let out a small, whimpering cry. Susan was already on the intercom, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, your attention, please. If there is a medical doctor or a certified medical professional on board, please identify yourself to a member of the flight crew immediately." The announcement rippled through the cabin, stirring passengers from their sleep. In the hushed, anxious silence that followed, no one came forward. Not from first class, not from business. Susan and another flight attendant exchanged worried glances. They brought out the emergency medical kit, fumbling with an oxygen mask, as Eleanor's breathing became more ragged, more desperate. Back in economy, Marcus Johnson was jolted awake by the urgent announcement and the sudden shift in the cabin's atmosphere. He'd been trying to study his mind a whirl of medical terminology and the lingering anxiety of his missed scholarship interview. Now snippets of hushed, worried conversations reached him. Pregnant woman. First class. Can't breathe. A cold dread washed over him. The symptoms, the pregnancy, the long flight. It all clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. Pulmonary embolism. He'd read about it, studied it, even discussed it with his grandmother after one of her frightening episodes with COPD. The risk factors for pregnant women on long flights were significant. He hesitated, a fierce internal battle raging. Who was he, a 17-year-old from Harlem, in worn jeans and a faded hoodie, What could he possibly offer that these trained flight attendants couldn't? The fear of ridicule of being dismissed was a heavy weight. But then he heard Eleanor's faint, panicked gasps carried on the recycled air, and saw the frantic, almost helpless movements of the flight attendants as one rushed past his row. He stood up, his lanky frame unfolding into the narrow aisle. "Excuse me," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the low hum of fear. I might be able to help. I think I know what's happening." The flight attendant, who had just passed a younger woman with a stressed expression, barely glanced at him. "We need a doctor, young man. Please return to your seat. It could be a pulmonary embolism." Marcus persisted, his voice a little louder, now tinged with an urgency that made her pause. "Pregnancy significantly increases the risk. Does she have any swelling in one leg? Is her heart racing? Is she gasping for breath between words?" The attendant stared at him, surprise and skepticism warring on her face. How would you know that? My grandmother, she has chronic lung and heart issues. I've helped care for her for years. I've studied this." The words tumbled out, a torrent of knowledge born from love and necessity. Just then, Susan's more urgent call came from the front. "We need oxygen now. Her saturation is dropping." The younger attendant looked from Marcus back towards first class, her indecision palpable. Marcus didn't wait. "If it is a PE, she needs high-flow oxygen immediately, and aspirin if you have it. It can help thin the blood and prevent the clot from growing." He started moving purposefully up the aisle. Arthur Sinclair, seeing this unknown teenager striding towards his critically ill wife, felt a surge of anger and disbelief. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice raw. "Where is the doctor? Get him away from her." Susan intercepted Marcus, her expression a mixture of desperation and a new fragile hope. "So there are no doctors on board. This young man, he seems to know something about this condition." "A kid." Arthur's voice dripped with scorn, his eyes sweeping over Marcus's simple clothes, his youth, his race. All his ingrained prejudices, the snap judgments that had served him so well in the cutthroat world of finance, screamed that this was an absurdity, a dangerous distraction. "He's a child. What could he possibly do? We need a professional." Marcus met Arthur's furious gaze, his own calm and direct, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. He spoke not to Arthur but to Susan, his voice clear and authoritative, despite the tremor he fought to control. "Ma'am, with a suspected pulmonary embolism, especially in a pregnant patient time, is critical. We need to elevate her legs slightly, ensure the oxygen mask has a tight seal, and is delivering the highest possible concentration. Do you have a pulse oximeter in your kit? We need to monitor her oxygen saturation and heart rate closely. And aspirin, 300 milligrams if available, crushed or chewed for faster absorption, assuming she has no known allergy or bleeding disorder." Every word was precise, confident, a stark contrast to the chaos and fear swirling around them. Eleanor, through a haze of pain and oxygen-starved confusion, heard the calm authority in Marcus's voice. Her eyes, wide with terror, flickered towards him, a silent plea. Susan, a veteran of countless flights, had seen her share of medical emergencies. She'd also learned to trust her gut. There was something in this young man's eyes, a depth of knowledge, a focused intensity that transcended his age and appearance. And right now he was their only option. "All right, young man," she said, making a swift decision, her voice tight but firm. "Show us. Help us." She turned to Arthur. "Sir, please let him try. We have to try everything." Arthur stared, his world tilting on its axis. His wife was dying. The professionals were helpless. And this boy, was speaking with a confidence that no one else in that first-class cabin possessed. The conflict within him was a raging storm, years of ingrained bias warring against the primal, desperate need to save the woman he loved, the mother of his unborn child. He looked at Eleanor's terrified face, her fingers clutching weakly at his, and something inside him broke. The fight went out of him, replaced by a raw, gaping void of fear. He nodded a single jerky movement. Do whatever you can," he choked out the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. He stepped back, a billionaire rendered utterly powerless, ceding control of his wife's life to an unknown teenager from an economy seat, in the pressurized confines of the first-class cabin, transformed into an impromptu emergency room thousands of feet above the churning ocean. A strange ballet of controlled urgency unfolded. Marcus Johnson, his youthful face, a mask of intense concentration, became the calm eye of the storm. Every prejudice, every societal marker that had moments before defined him in Arthur Sinclair's eyes simply evaporated, eclipsed by the sheer, undeniable competence radiating from the young man. "We need to keep her airway clear," Marcus instructed Susan, his voice even cutting through the ambient fear. "The oxygen, make sure it's at the highest flow. Can you try to find her pulse again? Mom and Mr. Sinclair." He turned to Arthur, who stood frozen, a statue of helpless anguish. "If you could just gently elevate her legs a little more with those pillows. Yes, just like that. It helps with circulation." Arthur, a man accustomed to issuing commands that moved markets and shaped industries, found himself taking direction from a teenager. He fumbled slightly with the plush first-class pillows, his movements uncharacteristically clumsy. He was acutely aware of Susan, the flight attendant, offering a quick, almost imperceptible glance that might have held a hint of sympathy, or perhaps he thought with a stab of shame, a discreet amusement at his sudden ineptitude in a crisis where his billions meant nothing. "The aspirin, did we locate any?" Marcus pressed his gaze, sweeping over the contents of the emergency kit Susan had spread open. "Yes, here. Another attendant." Emily produced a small packet. "Good. Mrs. Sinclair." Marcus leaned closer to Eleanor, his voice gentle but firm. "Can you hear me? We need you to chew these. It will help. Can you do that for us?" Eleanor's eyelids fluttered. She moaned softly, her hand still pressed to her chest, but she seemed to register his voice. With Susan's help, she managed to take the aspirin. Marcus then located the pulse oximeter in the kit, his fingers surprisingly deft as he clipped it onto Eleanor's finger. The small screen glowed, displaying numbers that made his frown deepen. Her oxygen saturation was dangerously low, her heart rate alarmingly high. "We need to inform the captain of the severity of the situation immediately," Marcus told Susan, his tone leaving no room for argument. "And reiterate the need to divert to the nearest suitable airport with advanced medical facilities. Time is absolutely critical." Arthur watched a dazed spectator to this life-and-death drama. He saw the way the flight attendants, seasoned professionals, now looked to this boy for guidance. He saw the focused precision in Marcus's every action, the way he interpreted the readings on the monitor, the quiet authority with which he spoke. This wasn't just a lucky guess. This was knowledge. Deep, practical, life-saving knowledge. And it was coming from a source he would have dismissed without a second thought only minutes ago. The foundations of Arthur's carefully constructed worldview were beginning to tremble. The captain's voice, grave and measured, soon crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a medical emergency on board, we will be diverting our course and making an emergency landing in Reykjavik, Iceland. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. We estimate arrival in approximately 1 hour. Iceland. A wave of relief, so potent it was almost sickening, washed over Arthur. They were going to land. Help was on the way. But beneath the relief, a new, uncomfortable awareness was taking root. Marcus, hearing the announcement, felt a complicated mix of emotions. Relief for Eleanor, certainly, but also a cold, sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Reykjavik. Not London. His interview, the culmination of years of relentless study and sacrifice, the single narrow gateway to his dreams, was scheduled for 10:00 in London. There was no way he could make it now. That one chance, his only chance, was slipping away with every nautical mile the plane diverted northward. He pushed the thought aside, his focus, returning fiercely to Eleanor. There would be time for his own disappointment later. Right now, a life, 2 lives hung in the balance. For the next hour, an eternity stretched thin by fear and hope. Marcus remained by Eleanor's side. He monitored her vital signs, adjusted her oxygen, spoke to her in low, reassuring tones, explaining what was happening, what they were doing. He seemed to anticipate her needs, her fears, before she could even articulate them. "Your body is fighting hard, Mrs. Sinclair," he'd say, his voice a steady anchor. "And we're all fighting with you. Just keep breathing with me. Slow and steady." Arthur watched it all, silent, humbled. He saw not a boy, but a healer. He saw a strength, a compassion, that he, with all his worldly success, felt he sorely lacked. The carefully constructed walls around his heart, built over years of boardroom battles and calculated risks, began to show cracks. He found himself remembering his own father, a man of simple means but profound integrity, a man who had always stressed the importance of looking beyond surfaces, a lesson Arthur now realized he had long forgotten. The descent into Reykjavik was tense. The flight attendants moved with quiet efficiency, their earlier panic replaced by a focused professionalism, clearly bolstered by Marcus's steady presence. As the plane finally touched down on the tarmac, a collective sigh of relief, almost a sob, rippled through the cabin. Paramedics were waiting, a stern-faced Icelandic medical team, ready to take over. As they carefully transferred Eleanor to a stretcher, one of the paramedics, a woman with sharp blue eyes, listened intently as Susan quickly relayed Marcus's initial diagnosis and interventions. The paramedic glanced at Marcus, a flicker of surprise, and then respect in her expression. "Good work, young man," she said, her English accented but clear. "You may have made all the difference." Eleanor was rushed off the plane, Arthur stumbling after her, his legs unsteady. Susan paused by Marcus's seat as the other passengers began the slow process of deplaning. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You did great, Marcus," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth and admiration. "Truly. After all this, well, maybe you should demand a first-class scholarship directly from Mr. Sinclair himself." She gave him a tired but sincere smile, trying to inject a moment of levity into the overwhelming exhaustion. Marcus managed a weak smile in return. "Just glad I could help, Ma'am." But his eyes were distant, already clouded by the thought of his grandmother waiting for news from London News that would now be very different from what he had hoped to share. Arthur, having ensured Eleanor was in capable hands and being transported to the hospital, found himself walking back onto the now nearly empty plane, an inexplicable pull drawing him towards the economy section. He saw Marcus still seated, staring out the window at the bleak, unfamiliar Icelandic landscape. The boy looked small suddenly and incredibly weary. The weight of the world, or at least the weight of a life, saved and a future lost, seemed to rest on his young shoulders. For the first time, Arthur Sinclair looked at Marcus Johnson and saw not a demographic, not a stereotype, but an individual, an extraordinary individual to whom he owed an immeasurable debt, The journey to Iceland was over, but Arthur had a sinking feeling that his own far more difficult journey was just beginning. The Landspitali University Hospital in Reykjavik greeted them with the sterile chill and hushed efficiency common to medical facilities Shamkblim Hjörvem the world over. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unforgiving glow on the pale green walls and linoleum floors, each footstep echoing slightly in the long, quiet corridors. Eleanor had been whisked away into emergency care, leaving Arthur Sinclair alone in a small, impersonal waiting room, the scent of antiseptic sharp in his nostrils. He sank onto a hard plastic chair, the adrenaline that had sustained him on the plane now draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a gnawing anxiety. Hours seemed to crawl by, measured in the slow tick of an institutional clock and the muted pause bleeps from unseen machines. Finally, a doctor, a tall woman with a kind but serious face, approached him. This was Dr. Thora Stefansdottir, the lead physician. Her English was impeccable. "Mr. Sinclair." She began, her voice gentle. "Your wife is stable. The preliminary diagnosis of a pulmonary embolism appears to be correct. The quick administration of oxygen and aspirin on the flight was remarkably astute. It likely prevented a far more severe outcome for both your wife and your child." She paused, a questioning look in her eyes. The flight attendant mentioned a young man who initiated these measures. Arthur nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Yes. A passenger. Marcus Johnson." Dr. Stefansdottir raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. His swift recognition and intervention were critical. "Mrs. Sinclair is very fortunate. She will require ongoing treatment and careful monitoring, but for now the immediate crisis has passed. She is resting. Fortunate." The word echoed in Arthur's mind. Eleanor was fortunate because of Marcus Johnson. The boy he had dismissed, scorned, wanted to physically remove from his wife's presence. Shame, hot and suffocating, washed over him. He remembered his own arrogant pronouncements, his instant, unthinking prejudice. The global humanitarian of the year. What a bitter, hollow charade that title now seemed. He had built an empire on shrewd judgments, on sizing up people and situations in an instant. And in the most critical moment of his life, his judgment had been not just flawed, but grotesquely, dangerously wrong. He needed to find Marcus. The airline, he recalled vaguely, had arranged accommodation for the stranded passengers. He made a call to Susan, the flight attendant, who had remained in Reykjavik to assist. Her voice was weary, but still kind. "Marcus Johnson." Susan said when Arthur inquired. "Yes, Mr. Sinclair. He's at the Hotel Natra with the others. A remarkable young man. Kept his head when everyone else was losing theirs, yourself included, if you don't mind me saying, sir." There was no malice in her tone, just frank observation. "Heard him on the phone earlier with his grandmother. Sounded like he missed something important in London, poor kid. A scholarship interview, I think he said." A scholarship. Arthur's stomach clenched. The boy had sacrificed his own future for Eleanor. The weight of his misjudgment, his ingratitude, pressed down on him. When Eleanor was finally settled in a private room, still pale but her breathing noticeably easier, her first coherent words were a whispered question. "Marcus. Is he all right, the young man?" "He's fine, my love," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite name. "He saved you, Eleanor. He saved both of you." He recounted what Dr. Stefansdottir had said, his own voice betraying his awe and shame. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I need to thank him, Arthur. Please, find him." Arthur found Marcus in the hotel's small, quiet lobby cafe later that evening. The teenager was sitting alone at a table, a cup of untouched coffee cooling before him, staring blankly at a crumpled tourist brochure of Iceland. He looked exhausted, the youthful resilience that had carried him through the crisis now depleted, leaving behind a visible weariness that tugged at Arthur's conscience. The confident medical prodigy from the plane had vanished, replaced by a tired boy, a long way from home, his dreams in tatters. Arthur approached the table, his expensive Italian shoes making no sound on the carpet. Marcus looked up, his eyes shadowed. For a moment there was a flicker of surprise, perhaps even apprehension, before his expression settled into a polite neutrality. "Mr. Sinclair." "How is Mrs. Sinclair?" "She's much better." "Stable. The doctors said. They said you saved her life." Arthur pulled out a chair and sat, feeling an uncharacteristic awkwardness. "They also said your intervention was remarkably astute." A faint flush rose on Marcus's cheeks. He looked down at the brochure. "I just, did what I thought was right, sir, based on what I've studied." "What you've studied," Arthur repeated the words, a quiet marvel. He leaned forward, the carefully constructed facade of the powerful CEO crumbling. "Marcus Rech, I owe you an apology. A profound one." He took a deep breath. "On the plane, when you first offered to help, I was dismissive. I was wrong. I judged you unfairly based on nothing but my own damn arrogance and prejudice." He finally said the ugly words aloud. "I pride myself on my financial foresight, on spotting value where others don't. But my human foresight, it seems, was utterly bankrupt when it mattered most. I am truly, deeply sorry." Marcus listened, his gaze steady, a quiet dignity about him that made Arthur feel even smaller. After a moment, he spoke, his voice low. "I understand, sir. It was a very stressful situation. For everyone." The simple, unassuming acceptance of his apology, devoid of any rancor or accusation, was almost more than Arthur could bear. This boy, who had every right to be angry, to be resentful, offered only quiet understanding. "It cost you, though, Arthur," pressed the guilt, a raw wound. "Your interview in London, Susan told me. That scholarship program." Marcus's gaze drifted back to the window, towards the darkening Icelandic sky. A fleeting shadow of pain crossed his face before he controlled it. "There will be other opportunities, I suppose." But the lack of conviction in his voice was evident. This had been the opportunity. "I want to compensate you for that," Marcus Arthur said, reaching for his wallet, the familiar gesture of solving problems with money. "For your time, for what you've lost because of us. Name your price." "Whatever it is." Marcus held up a hand, a small, polite gesture that nonetheless stopped Arthur cold. "Mr. Sinclair, please. There's no need for that. I didn't do it for money or for any kind of reward." He met Arthur's eyes directly, seeing Mrs. Sinclair safe, knowing she's going to be okay. "That's all the compensation I need." His words, so simple, so sincere, were like a physical blow. Arthur stared at him, this extraordinary young man who had faced down death, who had sacrificed his own dreams, and now sought nothing in return. The billionaire felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to weep, not just for his wife's salvation, but for his own profound, and until now unacknowledged poverty of spirit. He realized with a terrible clarity that the debt he owed Marcus Johnson could never be repaid with mere dollars. It was a moral debt, a human debt of a magnitude he was only just beginning to comprehend. The sterile air of the Icelandic hotel cafe, heavy with the scent of strong coffee and the unspoken anxieties of stranded travelers, did little to dispel the turmoil in Arthur Sinclair's mind. Marcus Johnson's quiet refusal of personal compensation had left Arthur feeling more indebted, more adrift than ever. He had built his life on transactions, on quid pro quo, on the clear, quantifiable exchange of value. But what Marcus had given, a second chance at life for Eleanor, for their unborn child, and perhaps Arthur was slowly beginning to realize for his own soul, was beyond any price he could name. He found Marcus the next morning, sketching idly in a small, worn notebook, the same lost look in his eyes. Arthur approached a new resolve hardening within him. He wouldn't be brushed off so easily this time. Marcus, he began sitting down uninvited, but with a gentler demeanor than before. We need to talk further about your future, your education, that program in London. It was clearly important to you. I have connections. I can make calls, open doors. Perhaps not that specific program if the timing is impossible, but others, excellent ones. Consider it an investment in a brilliant young mind that, quite frankly, the world needs. Marcus looked up, his pencil stilling. He seemed to weigh Arthur's words, a flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. He was silent for a long moment, then took a slow breath. "Mr. Sinclair," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, "I appreciate your offer. Truly, more than you know." He hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "There is something you could do. Not for me, not directly, but it would mean more to me than any scholarship, any personal advancement." Arthur leaned forward, intrigued and a little apprehensive. "Anything, Marcus? Anything at all?" "My grandmother, Esther." Marcus began, a deep affection warming his tone. "She's the strongest woman I know, but her health, it's a constant battle. COPD, congestive heart failure, arthritis, that gets worse every year." He described the small, underfunded community clinic in their Harlem neighborhood, the long waits, the overworked staff, the difficulty in accessing specialist care, especially for elderly patients on limited incomes. He spoke of the daily struggles not with self-pity, but with a clear-eyed, compassionate understanding of systemic failures. "She deserves better, Mr. Sinclair. They all do. The people in my neighborhood, they're good people. They work hard. But when they get sick, the system, it often fails them." He looked directly at Arthur, his gaze holding a quiet power that was utterly disarming. "If you really want to help, sir, help them. Help her. Help my community get the kind Ben Vien Chat Luong of care. Everyone deserves, regardless of their zip code or the color of their skin." The request, so unexpected, so profoundly selfless, landed in Arthur Sinclair's carefully ordered world, like a detonation. He had anticipated a request for tuition, perhaps seed money for a future practice, a networking introduction. Something tangible, transactional. Instead, this boy, this 17-year-old who had faced down death and sacrificed his own dreams, was asking for justice, for dignity, for others. Arthur opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. A strange pressure built behind his eyes, a prickling heat. He saw in a blinding flash of clarity the faces of the people Marcus described. He saw his own mother, years ago, struggling to navigate a confusing healthcare system before she passed. He saw the glossy brochures for the Rwandan medical center his foundation was building, a project born of tax incentives, lauded in philanthropic circles, yet a world away from the raw, immediate need Marcus was now laying bare right here in his own city. And then, to his utter astonishment, and to Marcus's visible alarm, Arthur Sinclair, the titan of industry, the man of iron control, began to weep. Not silent, dignified tears, but harsh, racking sobs that shook his entire frame, tearing through decades of carefully constructed, emotional armor. He covered his face with his hands, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of shame, regret, and a strange, painful kind of hope. Marcus, startled, half rose from his seat, his earlier composure vanishing. "Mr. Sinclair, sir, did I say something wrong?" He stammered, his eyes wide with concern. Or are the hospital bills in Iceland really that expensive? I'm sure we can—" Arthur waved a dismissive hand, struggling to regain his composure. He fumbled for a handkerchief, blew his nose with a sound that echoed slightly in the quiet cafe. "No, Marcus," he finally managed, his voice thick and raw. You said everything right. Everything I've needed to hear for a very, very long time, and was too damn blind and arrogant to see." He looked at the young man, his eyes red-rimmed, but shining with a new, almost fierce clarity. "You magnificent boy," he whispered, a sense of awe in his voice. "You truly are." Later that day, Arthur recounted the conversation to Eleanor. She listened, her own eyes filling with tears, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. When he finished, she squeezed his hand, her voice soft but firm. "Then that's what we'll do, Arthur. Not just for Marcus and his grandmother, but for us. For our child. For the kind of world we want her to grow up in." Her words solidified the nascent idea taking root in Arthur's mind. This wasn't just about writing a check. This had to be different, deeper, more personal. The next morning, before their rescheduled flight back to New York, Arthur approached Marcus again, this time with Eleanor by his side. Marcus Arthur began a new energy in his voice, a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. "Eleanor and I have been talking. Your request. It's opened our eyes. We want to establish a comprehensive community health initiative starting in Harlem, in your neighborhood. A state-of-the-art facility with the best doctors accessible to everyone." But he paused, looking directly at Marcus. "We can't do it without you. We have the resources, yes, but you have the insight, the understanding of what's truly needed, the heart." Eleanor stepped forward, her smile warm and genuine. "We'd like you to be a key advisor on this project, Marcus, to help us shape it from the ground up. And of course," she added, "this would include a full scholarship for your medical education, not as charity, but as an investment in your crucial role in this initiative. And naturally, the very best medical care for your grandmother, starting immediately." Marcus stared at them, his expression cycling through disbelief, caution, and then a dawning incredulous hope. He was silent for a long time, the weight of their proposal settling upon him. Finally, he nodded slowly. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll consider it," Arthur said gently. Marcus met their earnest gaze. "I'll do more than consider it, Mr. Sinclair, Mrs. Sinclair." A small, determined smile touched his lips. "I'll accept. But I have a few conditions, if that's all right." Arthur felt a surge of profound respect. Of course the boy had conditions. This wasn't a handout. It was a partnership. "We're listening, Marcus." 2 weeks later, Arthur Sinclair's gleaming black Bentley, a silent predator accustomed to the polished canyons of Wall Street, rolled with uncharacteristic slowness through the vibrant, pulsating streets of Harlem. It was a world away from his own, a symphony of sounds, sights, and smells that was both intoxicating and, for Arthur, deeply unsettling. He was on his way to meet Esther Johnson, Marcus's grandmother, a woman he already knew, sight unseen, possessed a formidable spirit. Eleanor sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his, sensing his unusual trepidation. "Nervous, darling?" she asked, a soft smile playing on her lips. Arthur Sinclair, who could command boardrooms and navigate billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was fidgeting with his cufflinks like a schoolboy before an exam. A little, he admitted, his voice a low rumble. It feels important, to make a good impression, not as Arthur Sinclair, the CEO, but just Arthur. Eleanor squeezed his hand. She'll see the real you, Arthur. The one I've always known was there beneath all the, synergistic leveraging. She winked, echoing Esther's anticipated aversion to corporate jargon, a detail Marcus had sheepishly shared. Marcus met them at the entrance to his apartment building, a pre-war structure that had seen better decades. His smile was genuine welcoming, instantly putting them somewhat at ease. Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair, welcome. Grandma Esther's been looking forward to this. And he added a mischievous twinkle in his eye. She's cooked enough food to feed a small army, so I hope you're hungry. The 5-flight climb to their apartment was an education in itself for Arthur. The narrow, dimly lit staircase, the lingering scent of diverse cooking, the sounds of life spilling from behind closed doors, and most notably, the prominent handwritten elevator out of order again. Sign taped to the elevator door on the ground floor. Each step Eleanor took, carefully navigated with Marcus's and Arthur's assistance, was a silent testament to Esther's daily struggle. Grandma hasn't been able to get downstairs for almost 3 weeks now, Marcus explained quietly as they paused on the 4th-floor landing for Eleanor to catch her breath. The oxygen tank is too heavy for her to manage on the stairs alone, and with my school and study. Well, it's tough. Arthur made a mental note, a sharp, decisive one. The elevator, the building's infrastructure. These weren't just details. They were fundamental to any meaningful health initiative. What good was a state-of-the-art clinic if patients couldn't even leave their homes to reach it? Esther Johnson opened the door before they could knock a small woman with an immense presence. Oxygen tubes rested discreetly in her nostrils, connected to a portable tank beside her chair, but she was dressed in a crisp, floral print dress, her silver hair neatly styled. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing as they swept over Arthur and Eleanor. So these are the airplane people, she said, her voice deep and resonant with a warmth that belied her scrutinizing gaze. She looked pointedly at Arthur. Mr. Sinclair, you look like you've seen a ghost, or perhaps just my 5 flights of stairs. Can't quite tell which is scarier for a man of your altitude. Arthur, caught off guard by her directness and the unexpected humor, actually chuckled. A bit of both, Mrs. Johnson, if I'm honest. And please call me Arthur. Esther will do just fine. Arthur, she replied, a slight smile touching her lips. Come in, come in. Don't let all the city's heat into my living room. The apartment was small but immaculately clean, every piece of worn furniture polished to a soft sheen. Family photographs adorned the walls, telling a story of love, resilience, and a life lived with dignity despite hardship. The aroma of cornbread collard greens and something sweet and spicy simmering on the stove filled the air, a comforting, an all-American home-cooked meal embrace. As they settled, Esther's gaze softened as it rested on Eleanor. You're looking much better, child, than Marcus described from that airplane. Good color in your cheeks. And how's that grandbaby doing? The baby is strong, Esther. Thank you, Eleanor said, warming instantly to the older woman's straightforward manner. And I feel wonderful thanks to Marcus. The Lord puts knowledge where it's needed, Esther said simply, then turned her full attention back to Arthur. Now, Mr. Sinclair, Arthur, Marcus tells me you have some grand ideas about a health program for this neighborhood. Arthur, despite his preparation, found himself stumbling slightly as he began to outline his vision for the Harlem Community Health Initiative. He spoke of funding, of partnerships, of bringing in top specialists. Esther listened patiently, then held up a hand. Hold on there, son. All that corporate talk, leveraging assets, stakeholder engagement, it gives an old woman a headache. Her eyes twinkled, but her tone was firm. "Speak plain English to me. What exactly are you planning to do for folks around here? Why here all of a sudden? And how do I know this isn't just some fancy new charity project you'll forget about when the next shiny thing catches your eye?" Her questions were like precision-guided missiles, stripping away any pretense. Arthur looked at Marcus, who watched the exchange with a quiet, supportive neutrality. He looked at Eleanor, who gave him an encouraging nod. He took a deep breath and abandoned his carefully rehearsed speech. He spoke from the heart then. He spoke of his awakening, of the shame he'd felt, of his realization that his previous philanthropic efforts, however well-intentioned in their later stages, had been distant, impersonal. He spoke of what Marcus had taught him, not just with his medical skill, but with his selfless request. He didn't try to impress. He simply confessed his own prior blindness and his newfound desire to make a tangible, lasting difference, starting right here in his own city, in Marcus's community. He even mentioned the broken elevator as a symbol of the systemic neglect he now felt compelled to address. Esther Johnson listened, her gaze, unwavering, her expression, unreadable. When Arthur finished, a long silence filled the small living room, broken only by the distant wail of a siren. Then, to Arthur's surprise, Esther chuckled, a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep within her. "Well now," she said, a genuine smile finally breaking through. "Honesty. At last, an honest millionaire. I think I might just survive to see that on my tombstone." She turned to Marcus. "This one baby. He might not be entirely hopeless after all. Might even learn a thing or two before he's done." The tension in the room dissolved. Over plates piled high with Esther's delicious cooking, food made with love and a lifetime of skill, they talked, really talked. Esther's sharp questions continued, but now they were constructive, aimed at shaping the initiative into something truly responsive to the community's needs. She spoke of the importance of doctors who understood the culture of transportation for the elderly, of preventative care, of health education programs run by people the community trusted. Marcus, emboldened, chimed in with specific examples, his youthful idealism tempered by a pragmatic understanding of the challenges. Arthur, for the first time in a long while, simply listened. He took notes. He asked questions not to assert his own knowledge, but to genuinely learn. He felt a sense of purpose, of authentic engagement that his multi-billion-dollar deals had rarely provided. He saw the path to redeeming not just his public image, but something far more important, his own integrity. As they prepared to leave, after Arthur had wholeheartedly agreed to Esther's and Marcus's conditions for community leadership and long-term commitment, and after he'd promised that the elevator would be one of the first things his foundation's infrastructure team would assess, Esther pulled him aside for a private word. "Arthur," she said, her voice low but firm, "I've watched you today. My grandson, he sees the good in people. Sometimes he sees it even when it's buried real deep." She fixed him with a piercing stare. "You've been given a chance to do something real. Don't you mess it up by trying to run things your old way. You listen to these folks. You listen to Marcus. He knows this place. He is this place." "I will, Esther," Arthur said, meeting her gaze directly. "I promise you that." She studied him for another long moment, then her expression softened. She reached out and patted his arm, a surprisingly strong grip. "Good. Now you go take care of that lovely wife of yours and that grand baby. And you tell Eleanor I expect her back for more of my sweet potato pie once that little one arrives. With a working elevator, mind you." As the Bentley pulled away from the curb, Marcus and Esther waving from the steps of their building, Arthur reached for Eleanor's hand. He felt lighter. Not just because a plan was in motion, but because a connection had been forged, a promise made, based not on wealth or power, but on shared humanity and a mutual hard-earned respect. The real work he knew was just beginning. From the fertile ground of remorse and a shared audacious hope, a new future began to blossom in Harlem. The intervening months had been a whirlwind of activity, a testament to Arthur Sinclair's newfound, deeply personal commitment. The old neglected community center on Marcus's block underwent a transformation not just in bricks and mortar, but in spirit. Arthur, to the initial surprise of many, was a frequent presence, not as a distant benefactor issuing directives, but as an active participant, listening more than he spoke, learning from community leaders from Marcus and from the indomitable Esther Johnson. The path wasn't always smooth. There had been early whispers of skepticism in the neighborhood. Another rich man's fleeting fancy, some had muttered. Then, a bureaucratic snag with the city council threatened to delay the delivery of a crucial MRI machine for weeks, a piece of equipment Esther herself had pointed out was desperately needed. The old Arthur Sinclair might have bulldozed his way through with lawyers and leveraged connections. The new Arthur, however, attended tedious community board meetings alongside Marcus, patiently explaining the initiative's long-term vision, his transparency, and genuine desire to serve, gradually winning over even the staunchest critics. He learned the art of collaboration, the power of a shared goal. And then, amidst the flurry of planning and renovation, about 3 months after that fateful flight, came a different kind of arrival. Estelle Grace Sinclair was born a healthy, beautiful baby girl with her mother's serene eyes, and Arthur swore a determined little chin that reminded him potentia of someone else he'd come to admire. Marcus Johnson, who had visited Eleanor and Arthur, regularly sharing his insights for the clinic while shyly accepting Eleanor's updates on her pregnancy, was asked, to his profound, tearful surprise, to be Estelle's godfather. The official opening of the Harlem Community Health Initiative, 6 months later, was a vibrant neighborhood celebration. The renovated building gleamed not with the cold opulence of Arthur's corporate headquarters, but with a warm, welcoming light. And yes, the elevator glided smoothly between floors. Esther Johnson, looking regal in a new lavender dress, cut the ribbon alongside Arthur Marcus and the clinic's newly appointed director, a respected doctor from the community. During her first checkup at the new facility, Esther, while having her blood pressure taken by a smiling young nurse, winked. "You make sure you take good care of this old ticker, dear. Got to stay healthy enough to keep an eye on my grandson, Dr. Marcus, and now my god-granddaughter, little Estelle. That's a full-time job, you know, managing geniuses and future presidents." The nurse chuckled, the atmosphere in the clinic palpably different from the strained, overburdened feel of the old one. Arthur, watching from a discreet distance, felt a warmth spread through him that no business triumph had ever ignited. He'd recently and very quietly declined an invitation to accept another prestigious international humanitarian award. The nomination had been for his past large-scale donations. He'd politely suggested they find someone whose work was more hands-on. Instead, he'd spent that morning at a town hall meeting discussing preventative health screenings for seniors in Harlem. Later that week, at a small private gathering to celebrate Estelle's christening, Arthur found himself holding his tiny daughter. He was, as Eleanor gleefully pointed out, remarkably clumsy, his large hands looking comically oversized as he tried to support Estelle's fragile head. "Careful there, titan of industry." Eleanor teased her eyes, sparkling with love and amusement. "She's considerably more delicate than your last merger." Arthur looked down at the sleeping infant in his arms, a profound sense of peace settling over him. And infinitely more valuable, he murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He caught Marcus's eye across the room. Marcus, now a confident pre-med student at Columbia. His scholarship fully funded his schedule, somehow balancing rigorous studies with his advisory role at the clinic and regular visits with his goddaughter. The young man nodded, a shared understanding passing between them. The journey had been an unexpected one, born of crisis, and a confrontation with deeply buried truths. Arthur knew the scars of systemic inequality wouldn't vanish overnight in Harlem or anywhere else. There was still so much work to be done. But now, looking at his wife, his daughter, at Marcus and Esther, he felt not the weight of overwhelming obligation, but the energizing call of a shared purpose. His legacy, he now understood, wouldn't be measured in the height of his skyscrapers or the breadth of his financial empire. It would be found in the quiet hum of a working elevator, in a Harlem apartment building, in the relieved smile of a patient receiving care at a community clinic, in the bright, hopeful future of a young man like Marcus, and in the innocent, trusting gaze of his daughter Estelle Grace. It would be found in the connections forged, the divides bridged, and the simple, powerful truth that the greatest investment one could ever make was in the well-being of another human soul. The boy on the plane had asked for nothing for himself, and in doing so had given Arthur Sinclair everything that truly mattered, and that Arthur knew was a debt he would joyfully spend the rest of his life repaying not with money, but with meaning. And so a single act of courage high above the clouds didn't just save lives, it rewrote futures, reminding us that true wealth is measured in changed hearts and connected communities. How often, perhaps, does a chance encounter hold the key to unlocking a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us? This journey of Marcus, Arthur, and Eleanor has deeply touched us here. We'd love to hear from you what moment in their story resonated most powerfully with your own experiences or gave you pause for thought. Your perspectives are invaluable, and if you have any suggestions on how we can make these stories even more impactful, please share them in the comments below. Your feedback truly helps us grow. If this story moved you, a like helps more people find it, and sharing it could bring a moment of hope to someone who needs it. To continue exploring these powerful journeys of connection and transformation with us, do subscribe and ring that notification bell. Thank you for being with us. Until next time, keep seeking the extraordinary in the everyday.